All right, folks. Thank you for coming in the first place. Hope you guys are having a good time at PDXCon. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Connor. I was the lead designer for Urban Warfare, and today, along with the guys up here with me, we're going to be talking about how we went through the process of creating the city biome and some of the technical challenges and design challenges that we overcame to do that. So we'll just kind of go down the line, and they'll introduce themselves, and yeah, we'll get it started.
Hi everyone, my name is Algernon Bolden. I am the lead engineer on BattleTech.
Hi, my name is Carlos Giraldo, and I'm a gameplay engineer for Urban Warfare.
I'm Alina Godfrey, an environment artist on BattleTech.
I'm Zach Hartledge. I'm also an environment artist on BattleTech.
And I'm Lee Scheinbeim. I'm technical artist in charge of lighting and rendering.
Cool. So basically, for those of you who don't know, BattleTech, I imagine you probably do, but in the event that you do not, is a game released by Harebrained Schemes last year. Urban Warfare, what we're talking about today, was our second DLC. It was an expansion that added a new biome, specifically the urban biome, to the game. And the goal there was to do a lot of new things. And so we have a few different things to show you on the slides, and we'll just start going through. So we don't, unfortunately, have our art director for this phase of the project, Marco Mazzoni, here with us today. He's with his family. But this was actually one of his first concept pieces that he started out that kind of set the tone for what we were going to be trying to achieve. Getting cities into the game was something that we wanted to do for a long time. There was early concept art going back all the way to 2015 before we shipped to try to get cities in. Obviously, with video games, we kind of have to focus sometimes, and we weren't able to do that. So it was a long-standing goal, and ultimately our second DLC was what we chose to use as the vessel to get those biomes into the game. So, I don't know, do you guys want to talk a little bit at length about some of this stuff?
Switched to...
Is it the next? Let me see. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. My bad. I'm getting it now. So I'm going to pass this over to the environment art folks, and they can talk a little bit at what they were doing there.
Cool. Yeah, so one of our big goals on the art side was to make these cities look like places where millions of people live and work every day. So not just a place to jump around on buildings and destroy everything, but like real-world locations. So this means that the environmental storytelling, like from the big picture stuff down to the little details, was very important for us, a big priority the whole way through. And we also wanted it to look like it was a part of the BattleTech world and fit in with the lore. So we had a lot of fun putting in lots of Easter eggs for the long-term fans that were based on that lore. So a big...
Oh, this is the one that's on screen.
Okay, yeah. So a big part of this was getting our buildings to look like they had a lot of variety and life to them. So we started putting together several different families of buildings to add variety to the city. So we decided upon 3 main families. We've got our really sleek and glassy corporate buildings, lots of big towers, very impressive looking, lots of shiny glass and stuff like that. We've also got more, this thing isn't working very well. Okay. We've also got our more squatty, sturdy military buildings with a bunch of reinforced ferrocrete, not so much glass, but just to look more like they could take a beating. And then finally, our civilian buildings, this is where the people of these cities actually live, were a little bit simpler in their shapes, some balconies, cheaper materials, a bit more flimsy. So with those 3 families of buildings, we were able to add some variety to these cities and help them feel more real. Next, where do these buildings go? What is the road layout? As you guys probably know, BattleTech is based on a hex grid system, which most cities are not, and this is for good reason, because it is a pain to design a city on a hex grid. So we ended up doing collaboration with all these guys here and came up with this system of these tiles, where when a designer was working on a new level, they could plan out the road plan and where the buildings would go using all of these little tiles. And Connor, you worked a lot with the ground plates. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so like Alina said, obviously BattleTech's based on a tabletop game, hex grids. We have basically a hex grid that underlies the entire game. Rectilinear city blocks aren't really great for that. You can even see in some of the examples here on our right-hand side where you have nice orthogonal 90 degrees hitting and actually kind of bisecting through smaller hexagons. That creates weird issues just abounding for our design side things. Things like occupancy, what happens when you're halfway in between one thing and another thing. Even mech movements. Mechs move along the dots, and so sometimes you'll see them zigzag across the streets. So laying out a thoughtful system for how these streets would come together was relatively important. We worked with our other environment artist, Zach Whitchurch, who's not here with us, but was basically putting together and kit bashing all these various corner pieces to create a library of various what we called ground plates, which are just big old like 256 meter by 256 meter blocks that would be essentially the foundation for each city. And so what that gave us the opportunity to do was essentially create what you would see in a modern metropolis, sort of like a grid or a more thoughtfully aligned organization of roads. And then what we do is just fill in the negative space. So you can see where the roads are aligned, and you can see a bunch of open hexes near them. So then Alina and the rest of the environment team, along with Zach, would then create structures, and we fill that space back in. So we started with the roads. That was actually the basis for everything. The important thing to note here is like this actually changes the entire way that we make our maps. Previously, we were using totally like manually formed terrain. And what we're doing now was a lot more mathematical, a lot more straightforward in the approach, and we had to do a lot of extra work to kind of make that happen, and ultimately rebuilt our map system almost from scratch for this release. So, yeah.
And another big part of helping our cities feel lived in was our parks. The green spaces, the plazas, from a gameplay perspective, these were very useful because just as in the base BattleTech game, we have this forest cover where you can hide your mechs, as well as the fountains and pools where you can go in and get the cooling effects. Zach, you worked a lot on like the assets and the layout of these. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I worked a little bit on some of the statues, and it was kind of interesting working with Marco, our concept artist, and having some of these play spaces with, in a lot of the other biomes, we have water and forest, and it's very organic, and it makes sense to have big lakes and large forested areas, and it was kind of fun trying to fit this into an urban environment and have it still make sense and have that gameplay capability at the same time.
Well, I think the interesting too that's a little bit different is when we were making our natural maps, we used a lot of automatic generation for the trees, and Zach worked a long time with Lee as well as some of the other artists to create what looked like natural foliage, but just with the click of a button. And when we came into urban warfare, we knew that wasn't going to be possible because of, again, the underlying foundation of what we were building on had changed. So the question kind of became, how do we go about doing it? And the interesting thing is sometimes the best way to solve a problem is with a hammer. And so rather than actually doing automatic generation of trees in the urban biomes, Zach actually hand-placed along with Lena all of the trees. So all the trees that you see in the urban world.
We had a couple tools, some that Carlos worked on even, that did help us in the end, but it's another good point of why it was so interesting working on this biome as opposed to the other ones. With them being more organic, we made a lot of tools and had a lot of ideas for making things look really randomized and different, and approaching this biome was different because it's so rigid and mechanical in a way, more so.
And actually, shout out to our tools developer, Chris Heck, who's down at the booth if you guys have talked to him. He did actually have some early prototypes on a linear generation of trees so that it would look like it was manicured, and we got a few outcomes, but ultimately the best thing we found was actually just, for the most part, hand placement.
Yeah. Another actually interesting thing that you can see in this here, Marco and I were working on what would be kind of good statue designs to have in the city, and we knew we wanted these really large plinths, kind of that you see here. And we were trying to decide what kind of bird to put on it, and with the urban biome, we introduced the Raven mech to the game, and so this is actually a call out to the Raven. we have a statue of it to
Yeah.
to go along with the mech that was introduced.
Yeah, so these parks were also pretty fun because we had a bunch of like kiosks and benches and places to sit, well-lit paths, etc. That just made it feel pretty lived in. So those were a lot of fun to put together in contrast to the more rectilinear forms of the rest of the city.
Yeah, a lot of the human scale kind of paths and things really kind of brought it together and made it look more used and had it make more sense, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I do want to talk about before we move forward is a challenge that presented itself to urban maps that which is similar to our natural maps, is that instead of trees being a problem in terms of like spreading them across a whole plane, we now have to deal with thousands and thousands of cars that have to obey the rules of traffic somewhat. You know,
Generally.
Generally have to obey the rules of traffic. And so we wanted to save the artist's time as much as possible, because hand placing 5,000 different cars and rotating them and for all the different maps that we had, and not only cars but other things like street lights that needed to be placed along every sidewalk, and we also had other tools that help with like just grid layouts, because we wanted to have a quick way of fine-tuning a lot of these values for performance reasons. You know, we wanted to settle in a good number that would run well with most machines. And so we leveraged Houdini for a lot of this. It took us a while to discover the best way to do this. We talked earlier about the ground plates, and we found that trying to have the art team embed certain information into these assets, into these base assets, allowed us to then quickly take all that, pass it to a program like Houdini, which is specialized in, is used a lot in VFX for like making procedural like elements. In our case, we passed the ground plates, basically the whole layout of the city, and from that it spits out just all the cars, with buses, and placed all the sidewalks, and that made populating a whole city with life in almost a snap of a button. And it helped us create more variety in the different cars, because as we get a new car, it was very easy to just put it into our tools, and it will automatically populate into the city.
Yep.
And special thanks to Dave McCoy, which was another of our technical artists who I worked with to not only help with the population of the cars and streetlights, but also the buildings, which we'll talk about a little bit more later.
Yep.
Yeah. As environment artists working on these giant maps, we were very grateful to have the work of Carlos and Dave to get all these props placed, because that would have been a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of props.
Speaking of props, so many props were made in these maps, and these are some concepts again from Marco, and you can see that they show the clutter of the city, of any city that you see normally, but kind of in that BattleTech aesthetic, sort of an 80s/futuristic look. So we had a lot of fun building these and putting them together. Here, for instance, are some of our cars, a close-up view of the street. Again, with that environmental storytelling, when you see all these cars abandoned on the street, our idea was that when people heard that there was a battle about to happen, that they fled the city as quickly as possible, leaving their vehicles right where they were. So that's just a fun way to get some crunchy elements in when you're running around
The cities were totally unpopulated.
Yes, no people.
No weird ethical boundaries crossed
Yes.
with civilians here.
Good storytelling going on.
Exactly. While we're looking at the props in the cars, Lee, you touched a lot of this stuff when it came to both colorizing and some of the variations in that stuff. Do you want to talk about the cars and the lighting on that stuff?
Sure, yeah. So for the cars, we used a rendering technique called instancing, where instead of having to draw each car individually, we can draw huge chunks at once, and we can pass data per instance, is what we call it. So we defined several color palettes for different kinds of cars that were randomly applied when the game starts. So I guess they're technically not even the same color every time, but it's hard to tell because there's so many cars.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a lot of stuff like that we had to do.
And then with the lights on the cars, because I don't know, we might get a night shot a little bit later.
There
with
are
some of
some
the
night
cars.
shots.
A little bit.
Yeah, all right. So maybe we'll talk about the lighting
Yeah.
a little bit more on that point.
Cool. Yeah, so we'll just go through some of the props and greebles that we have scattered around. And this will, these are some of our in-process art review things that as a team we all looked at in the making of the game. So you get a little behind-the-scenes look at our art process here. So we've got a bunch of stuff that goes on roofs, antennas, satellite dishes, things like that. Dumpsters, a must-have in any city. A lot of these were, again, created by our environment artist, Zach Whitchurch, a very good hard surface modeler. We've got some vending machines, a coolant flush, a BattleTech favorite.
As many urban mechs as we could cram in there.
Yes.
You see a little urban mech on the top left-hand corner of that coolant flush machine.
Public transit, of course, has to make an appearance in this city. And we also put little ads on all our buses with references to the lore, so this shows the Maker brand. Some of our kiosks, places where people could go and get snacks on their way to work. Again, no people in these cars, but they look pretty cool. Space crates, a must-have in any sci-fi game.
Yes.
Again, these have that instance tint support for some more info or for some more visual interest. Yeah, and holograms and signs. So this was kind of like the icing on the cake of these maps was the signage, which added a lot of cool visual interest and also gave us an opportunity to include lots of recognizable names from the lore. So we were pretty excited to have these in here. So our VFX artists, Will and Tracy, put together this cool system for displaying the signs in this dynamic way. So lots of stuff in here that you probably recognize from the lore, the Canopus Delights,
Yeah,
Maker.
weapons manufacturers,
Yeah.
mech manufacturers, pizza, urban mech, again, featured
yes, the
prominently
urban mech.
throughout.
Yeah, he's not here, but Will Avery worked on this. My favorite one over here is the Urban Mech one.
Yeah,
we-
Lee, can you talk a little bit about the holograms? Because this was one of those things that gave us a bit of a headache when we were putting it together.
Yes, it did.
I mean, generally
So-
speaking, if you saw in the previous maps that we've had, not a lot of point lighting, a lot of ambient lighting via the moods, right? These were uninhabited natural terrains for the most part, so this was now just like awash with light, and it caused...
Yeah, so the
Yeah.
biggest issue with these was actually so many of them are animated, and there's so many just ambient smoke effects as well, just in the city, like from chimneys or that kind of stuff. So we had to write a system that could figure out which ones were actually on screen and close enough to be seen, and turn off the ones that were not seen to keep them from simulating in the background all the time for performance reasons. So we had to write a whole bunch of stuff around that.
Yeah, and then Carlos, I remember we were also having, once we got the holograms working, and then on all the buildings, we had to then also make it such that when the buildings went away, the holograms did too. So,
Oh yeah, a lot of focus went into trying to, when buildings blow up, we want everything to cascade and destroy in a really cool, spectacular way. And buildings, they had a lot of stuff packed into them. Holograms, they had props, vents, everything. And we wanted to set it up in a way where it was easy for artists to place buildings and have props there and have all of our automated tools kind of like just make sure that all that is included when a building is destroyed. And so we try to pay special attention to like when buildings destroy, like it does like a wave effect of the props as they destroy, it radiates, and it's hard to see sometimes because the buildings destroy pretty quickly. But if you, the larger the building, the larger the wave, and you can kind of like see how it spreads around along in the map.
yeah, we'll get into destruction a little bit later as we continue on.
Yeah.
Yep. And then the smallest details of all these are the neon signs that are street level. So you probably only see them when you're zoomed way in for a battle sequence. But these were another fun thing of getting some cool day-to-day life references in there. So we've got liquor stores, cafes, bookshops, all that stuff that you see in a normal city, and some good puns and bars and things in there as well.
More Urbies, still more
More
Urbies.
Urbies.
More.
There's going to be more. We're doing more urban mechs. It's going to keep happening.
And then we got some info on lighting. Lee, do you want to take this?
Lighting. This was, I think, the first real screenshot I put together when we were working on Urban Warfare, once we started getting everything kind of working, which was nice. For urban maps, again, contrasting with our previous maps, which were just lit by the ambient light and the sunlight, urban maps were lit by lots of lights. But before we get there, first we have the moods. So moods work in urban maps the same way they work in our other biomes, in that we have a set of moods that we authored for all urban maps, which we can swap between based on various design criteria. So we have the afternoon mood, we have the overcast mood, or Seattle. We have the smoggy mood, or LA. And then sunset. And here's when we start actually turning on some of the lights. So I had a switch that I put into the mood system so I could control, are the buildings lit up, are the street lights on? So started turning them on sunset, and then nighttime where everything's on. This is a shot of a map. I can't read which map I picked. It's on the top somewhere. But all
Capitol
those,
Hill, named
Yep.
after one of our neighborhoods in Seattle.
Yes.
There you go. Every single red circle on there is a light, mostly from the street lights. So previously on our maps, we had maybe 10 to 20 lights maybe active at a time, mostly on the mechs, some on some VFX, explosions, and that sort of thing. So this was the first time we tried actually putting lights everywhere. So we had to write some extra custom stuff into our custom lighting system to make sure it could handle that many lights. It's hard to sort of see it here by design, but the lights that are close to the camera are actually lights. The lights that are past a certain distance just turn into sort of sprite blobby things, so they're not technically lights anymore. And you do things like that to make the game performant, because otherwise you've got too many lights. Just as a little side thing, this is the mood controller that I built. So these are all the different settings we have to set what a mood looks like. It's a bit overcomplicated, but it generally works. So for urban maps, most of the things that we had to add for it were the night light settings, so we could trigger if the lights are on or not. And that's mostly for lighting. We've also got, let's see if this GIF plays. So this is one of the buildings. I think this is yours, Alina?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, so this is showing some of the shader effects that we did to make the buildings look more like buildings. Instead of having to build all the geometry like we did for our previous buildings in the base game, we use a technique called parallax mapping, where you have the artist make a height map, and then that height map is using the shader to create the illusion of depth without there actually being depth. And at the distance we normally see the buildings at, that works pretty good. We also had another trick, which is, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's another shader that's sort of tricking the rooms inside the building, so you can kind of get a little hint of depth in there without having to actually model all those little rooms, because that would not be fun. And a little bit of destruction. So this is that same building destroyed without any of the VFX. So this is again generated from Houdini. Did you work on that part of it as well, or was that
Dave
was
McCoy?
Yeah.
who's
AJ
not
might
here,
have some
worked on
thoughts on
that.
some of the
Yeah.
destruction stuff there.
Yeah.
So how we did with the destruction is that, given this is a few thousand polygons, is we actually have two separate meshes. So while you have the static buildings in place, we actually occlude this destruction animation going on, which makes it very interesting when you destroy 5 or 6 buildings at the same time. That becomes a very tricky proposition between this and the VFX together. So for a lot of those, we did a lot of camera tricks. So if you ever see in our game a lot of smoke and fire effects, that's probably why.
Quite literal smoke and mirrors.
Yes. The destruction itself is pre-generated out of Houdini and actually saved into a texture, which is then played back in the shader. So it's not really being destroyed in real time in the sense that it's not a physics simulation at runtime, but it was a physics simulation before.
Yeah, we're basically playing back a recording of what looks like good destruction.
Yep. And yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Keep on.
okay.
Yeah, pass it on down.
Oh, I guess we talked about a bit about Houdini.
Yeah, so we can talk a bit about the creation of our buildings here. So these are more concepts that Marco put together, envisioning how in these cities the buildings were created. So he was thinking this would be kind of like a 3D printed building. Initially, we were hoping to get some animated 3D printing actions in
Something
there.
along those lines,
Yeah, unfortunately, that was one of the things that got cut, but they still look pretty cool. But really how we made the buildings, you can go to the next slide, was through these modular pieces. So as environment artists, we created different pieces for each building's lobby, tower, and top. And this allowed us to have a pretty wide variety of different building look and feels without having to individually model out hundreds of different types of buildings. So when you have a small team like ours, it's always nice to have these tricks that help us to get more of a variety for less of an effort. So this shows Dave McCoy's tool that he made in Houdini that lets us decide how tall the tower should be, what base it should have, and what the top of it should look like, and if there should be any additional towers kind of mashed together. So yeah, do you want to say anything more about that process?
And no, but well, or not that I have much more to add, but yeah, it was a really quick way to iterate and get a lot of different we created these initial shapes, and then putting them together, putting the towers and the lobbies together in different pieces, made us have a really big variety out of just a couple of puzzle pieces, I would say. Yeah. Pretty interesting.
Cool. And on that note, it was the same kind of deal with the materials. So we wanted our different types of materials to work well with all these different buildings. So we designed a trim sheet system that let us change out the building materials pretty quickly. These were created in a program called Substance Designer, which we, as environment artists, really love for just quickly generating lots of different types of building materials that's probably my favorite part of this project, was making all these cool building materials.
Yes, making the materials is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So this is the actual destruction data. I just took a screenshot of it because I thought it looked cool. This is what Houdini generates out, and I'm trying to remember which axis is which, but for the one on that side, that's the position data for each chunk of the building. And on that side, it's the rotation data for each chunk. So that actually stores out how the building collapses. And looking at them, they look pretty incomprehensible, but lines look cool, so, colors.
I think the only other thing I'll add really quick is that for a lot of our origin maps, we have anywhere between 12 to 25 different buildings. For a single urban map, we had between, 500 to 1,200 individual buildings. So this was an exponential increase in the amount of buildings that we're rendering and how much that we have to have for not only terrain collision, but for gameplay complications.
Yeah, so, we've gone through a lot of the technical stuff of how we built the thing, and obviously there's a lot of considerations to putting these maps together, putting the assets together, obviously a lot of challenges to overcome, but I think it's all sort of in service of the overall goal of ultimately what we started all this out as, which is trying to bring the cities to life in BattleTech. And it's one of the things that we really wanted to do, because ultimately, when we look at BattleTech, you think about the inner sphere, you think about the succession wars, and people live in civilizations, they live in dense population centers, and being able to see just kind of the breadth of these larger maps with these buildings in it just made everything different from how we looked at it, how we lit everything, how we built everything, but also hopefully how you were playing the game. And it had a lot of impacts on how we had to design things. So obviously it's going to change how much elevation is changing, how frequently it's changing, how mechs are able to move. So we actually had to do a pretty significant overhaul of the AI system as well when it came to navigation. So shout outs to our AI programmer, Ali, as well as Kevin, our AI designer. They did do a lot of work to make sure that things were working effectively so that those mechs weren't getting stuck, caught on corners. And our old arch nemesis, which is elevated peninsulas, that's those situations where when you have a building, for instance, that might have a ramp going into it, you have a situation where there's only one entrance and one exit. Mechs and AI really don't like that, so they would just typically stand there and get shot. So after many, many hours and lots of iteration, we were able to fix those sorts of issues. And ultimately what came together was a pretty awesome experience for at least us when we were seeing these buildings coming down and the destruction making those maps change as you play through them as well, right? So it's not just that, okay, I'm coming in here, there's a lot of sightline interruption, there's a lot of interesting pathways for me to move through with these mechs, these beautiful buildings, but also as I'm playing, we worked with our engineer, Brenton, who's one of our gameplay engineers, to add a new system, which you may have seen on some of the demonstrations earlier this week, or if you've been playing, you've played with it, stray shots. Previously in BattleTech, if you fired and missed, the missile goes off into the middle of nowhere. Maybe it hits something, but nothing really happens. Now what we wanted to do is basically make it collateral damage. The reason being there, we wanted to slowly see these buildings and these cities just sort of collapse under the sort of heavyweight knockout matches that are happening between these huge mechs. So that was one of the other issues we had to manage with destruction, was how can we instance the visual effects so that as you're not only having your mech with all the visual effects that are associated with it, firing with all the visual effects that are associated with that, hitting the other enemy mech, all the visual effects and animations associated with that, and then hitting other structures. You get into a lot of polygons. So after lots of performance testing and squeezing, AJ and Lee and some of the other engineers, along with Carlos, were able to fix some of the performance issues we were having there and actually make improvements across the board. I think we had some gains that improved the entire game. Is that right?
Oh yeah, I think we improved it by at least 5 to 10 frames per second on the original maps just because of how much we had to squeeze for urban.
Yeah. So I think that's the most of what we have right now. Obviously, we have a lot of different things that went in urban warfare. We had ECM, we had the Raven, but the real centerpiece was the buildings, the real centerpiece was the cities, and making that a possibility. We really think it made a lot of differences, both for how the game looks. Obviously, if you guys watched the demonstration that Mitch and Ryan just did up on the main stage, you got to see some of the new cool stuff that's happening with heavy metal, the thumper cannon. I think Ryan leveled a few buildings as well as a few mechs, which always looks amazing. And it's really great to see those sorts of things in urban warfare being carried forward and actually being leveraged again in heavy metal. So I think that's what we have in terms of what we're trying to look at. We want to open it up to questions. We got a lot of people on the BattleTech team here who have a lot of experience on BattleTech, as well as the larger kind of harebrained schemes portfolio of games. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand at this time. Stacy over here has a microphone. She can pass it over to you and we can answer questions.
Okay. Check.
And if you just want to say your name just so we know. And
Hi, I'm Peter.
Hi, Peter.
What's the design cycle look like in terms of back and forth between the environmental engineers and the software engineers? Like, what's the turnaround? How long are you going off and prototyping things before you go to a software engineer and say, is this idea we had plausible or implementable?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That is a good question.
So we initially started with the overall maps. We knew we wanted to add the structures. As Alina went through and all of us went through, we kind of had an idea of how we wanted to build the frameworks of the cities. In terms of building the maps, the designers, we would put together those ground plates to create the framework for the city, and then we'd start putting assets on them. And then back and forth between myself, Zach, Ryan, Alina, and Zach, our other environment artists, we would basically go back and forth. We'd make a layout for a map, add structures to it. The artist would come in, beautify it, add more density, and then we'd keep going back and forth, testing and iteration. Obviously, we found performance issues we needed to fix. That's for at least the design of the overall maps. In terms of the buildings and the assets, Alina and Zach might have some insight there.
Yeah, well, we definitely had quite a bit of back and forth at the very beginning of jumping into urban warfare because we weren't quite sure how we were going to we saw that animation of how the towers were coming together. And Elena did a lot of work with Dave in trying to figure out how exactly we actually wanted to even build the buildings to begin with, because it was such a different task from some of the other structures that we had already in the game, and we knew that they needed to be simplified and handled a little bit differently. So there was definitely a lot of back and forth at the beginning stages, and up until it kind of smooths out into one, like, hey, this is what we're going to be running with. Yeah. Certainly a couple weeks up to maybe months, I would say.
Yeah, and it definitely got a lot faster as we got all of our tools on board.
Yes.
So when we did, what, 6 maps total?
Was it
yeah, I
8?
think we had
Yeah.
6. Yeah, I think we had 6 and plus an arena map, so maybe 7 total.
Seven maybe, yeah.
So the first couple maps took us several weeks of collaboration to get them all art passed, and then at the same time our tools were getting on board. So by the end of it, we were getting through those maps pretty darn quickly with all the tools that we got.
Towards the end.
So it definitely varied a lot.
Yeah, we had to go through a lot of iterations of how the structures were actually put together, and AJ had to kind of push on a lot of those efforts to make sure that the buildings were behaving correctly. And for those of the game developers in the audience, you know that sometimes when you build something placeholder ships. And so it was AJ and a little bit of my responsibility to go through and make sure we were not throwing anything in there that wasn't belonging there. And you want to talk a little bit about how we did the building system?
Sure. So a lot of what I did during Urban Warfare is about modularity and scale. So Capitol Hill is actually a very interesting case study because that area was all placeholder and prototype work. That was very bespoke, unique instances of every building that the artist did, very beautifully rendered. But as we said, that was 500 buildings in that scene, all hand placed. So it was my job then to come in to say, how can we repeat this effort a few hundred times without the artist needing to do it? So what we end up doing in Unity is the concept of the prefab. So once they had 5 or 6 templates to go by, we would get those saved out, and then can then do hot swap using nested prefabs of things like materials, the signage and holograms. Any of those can be hot swapped between each other to give kind of the illusion of unique building placements while not having to actually hand place each and every one. So that actually increased the iteration time between a few days to do a section of a map to a few hours.
Yeah. Initially, everything was being built by hand, and so to answer your question, it was Alina almost building a lot of the buildings from scratch, and then once it looked good, we had to go back with AJ and figure out how to turn it into a process that was repeatable. And by the end, we got it working, but it was a bit sketchy at first. Very much so. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts on Urban Warfare? We can take that now.
Hello, my name is Henry. And
Hi.
I would like to ask you, on the main stage I heard that there will be official mod support in the next...
Sorry, yeah, could you speak a little louder for us?
Yeah, I heard that there will be official mod support in next version. Does that mean that we will have access to these tools too, that you are using?
Yeah, AJ, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
So with mod support, you're not going to have direct access to these particular tools because these are all Unity based. What we are not preventing doing is if you have any sort of third-party solution for it, to doing any sort of hot swaps. But no, a lot of these are kind of embedded and internal to the studio for right now. In future, we'll see.
Yeah.
Any other questions, guys? Okay, over here.
Hi, this is Ian again. So since you've got Unity already set up, how long it's going to take you to get going on a clan or dating sim?
Clan dating sim. I don't know. That's not something that we had on the schedule, although for those who've been around at Harebrained Schemes a long time, and if those of you are aware, we were responsible for putting together, well, AJ mostly, not me, the Shadowrun games. And we've definitely talked about making dating sims, because that Shadowrun engine's pretty robust, and it's very conversation-oriented. So we've talked about making dating sims before in a, in a joking capacity, but never thought about the clans, so we might have to put that one on the list. I don't know.
Ask Mitch, please.
Ask Mitch. Ask Mitch. Mitch is somewhere around these halls. If you can convince him, AJ and I will get right on it. I mean, #1 priority. No lie.
I was going to say, isn't that like a dream game for you, AJ?
Yes.
It's not just one person in the studio who wants to make that happen. Trust us. I don't know. Maybe if you see Ebba, go over Mitch's head. I'm sure he would like that. I'm sure he wouldn't be upset at all to hear that from Ebba and not from us. Yeah. Great. I think I saw one over here as well. Yeah?
Thanks. My name's Jason. I just want to follow up on the modding question. I guess more simply, in the next expansion, what is going to be moddable? And I guess for you guys, maybe on the graphics side, do you have any kind of like helpful hints for modders? Because I played a lot of other Paradox games, and text files and stuff are usually pretty easy stuff to go after for modders, but the graphics are always, there's a few super skilled people, and that's about it. So I was wondering kind of how you guys think modding will work outside of just kind of adding mechs and stats and so on.
Yeah. So initially for BattleTech 1.0, we couldn't necessarily support full modding, but the engineering team led by AJ made a pretty substantial effort to, like you said, make a lot of the data of the game exposed, and that's also a lot of what actually the designers like myself and Ryan and others actually used as our primary way of making the game different. And obviously up to this point, modders have done a really great job of taking what was exposed there and creating a litany of mods that are out there. So shout outs to that mod community, because there's some really great stuff. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend you take a look at it. In terms of what's coming next, AJ's been looking a lot at the larger scale mod support that's coming in 1.8.
So yeah, really quick give shout outs to our technical director, Chris Hardapple, and then our engineer responsible for mod support, Aiden Nabaz. So what we're doing is doing a lot of work with the teams that already exist and determine what their process is of already integrating their stuff into our game and just making it easier and more streamlined. Really the biggest part of what you're asking for is documentation, and that's going to be the biggest effort for us internally and also with them to figure out what their processes are. What we give to you pretty much instantly is the JSON files and the content and doing the tweakables. Those that are easy for graphics. That's actually going to be a process that's been really highlighted by, I would say, Rogue Tech.
Yep.
And so that's to answer your question is we don't fully know yet, but we're actually going to be working with them to actually make it easier for other modders to do what they did.
Yeah, I think one of the things we were looking at was some of how the content is handled in the game and assets, bundling how those things are done so that it's easier for modders to insert those into the game without having to write a lot of custom work. So that if they do have assets, mechs, things like that they want to add, it's a bit more of a direct process to put those things into the game as opposed to decompiling the game in a larger sense and trying to rewrite a lot of it. So the way to look at it is less like a large set of tools we're delivering to the modders and more like opening a lot of doors that were previously locked or just kind of jammed, and making those pathways way more open for them to take the assets they've already been building for previous mods and making it easier for them to integrate them into the game. So hopefully that works for them. If it doesn't, they'll be sure to tell us. They will. Yeah. Any other questions? Thoughts? Oh? All right. Speak now. Forever hold your peace. Wonderful. All right. Thanks very much, guys, from myself.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.